So, good afternoon. I would like to introduce you Professora Cristiana Seixas. Cristiana holds a PhD in Environmental and Natural Resource Management in University of Manitoba, Canada, and Masters in Ecology in University of Campinas. Cris is based on Environmental Studies Research Center, NEPA, at University of Campinas, and she coordinates Commons Conservation and Management Research Group that we call CG Commons, which we have some members of the group here, like Deborah, Ana Carolina, Leopoldo, and myself. And I'm really sure you're going to have a good presentation. So, Cris.
Thank you. Thank you, Leandra. Hello to everyone. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. When I got the invitation from my dear colleague Alex Turra to come here, I said, wow, this would be a big adventure for me. I am not used to teach, so I am a researcher at the University of Campinas, and I usually teach small groups, like only grad students, like 10 to 15 people. So having a classroom like that is something new for me. Anyway, I'll do my best. Please feel free to interrupt and make questions if you have any doubt what I'm talking. Okay, it's better like that? Okay, it's just strange. No, that's fine. I'll try. Okay, so the title here is a little bit different from the one initially proposed, as the idea I have in this first session is to give you some basics of how to think about research and governance regarding coastal marine systems. And that has to do with the approach to look at this system. And the approach I'm bringing and trying to share with you is this approach about complex systems, socio-ecological systems, adaptive systems. So the idea of this first hour and a half is to understand the basic concepts that underline this concept of socio-ecological systems, to talk about some frameworks that has been used to look at, to manage, to understand the dynamics of socio-ecological systems. Then I hope I can help you to think on your own systems, your own research. So I have some questions in trying to help you think what's the boundaries of your socio-ecological systems if you are working with this perspective, and even if you're not working with this perspective, to consider that. And then a few examples. So, socio-ecological systems are considered complex systems. And what are complex systems? Complex systems has several characteristics that stem from interaction of its parties. This is very uncomfortable, I tell you. There are interactions and patterns that emerge from the interactions of the parts of the system. So it's more than just the sum of the parts. It is non-deterministic, unpredictable, it's process-dependent, it has multiple feedbacks, and it self-organizes. When complex systems has the capacity to self-organize, to learn and adapt, they're called complex adaptive systems. And they have some properties that is related to, for instance, aggregation, nonlinearity, diversity, uncertainty, self-organization, and resilience. We won't have time to talk about all these properties here, but I've focused on a couple of them throughout this class. So if you think of a system, the parts, they interact with each other, they are affected by external environment, they affect the external environment, they have amplifying feedbacks and dampening feedbacks, negative feedbacks. And the properties of these that emerge from these interactions are called complex adaptive behaviors. So when do we see complex adaptive behavior in life? In many places. Complex adaptive behavior we see when, what's the name of that? The birds are flying, flocking birds. We see complex adaptive behavior in ants and termites. We see when there is traffic jam and slowing traffic jam. And we see in fish schooling too, and ecosystems and in human societies, just to give some of the examples. So just a nice picture of how systems self-organize. And there is this, why the fish schooling move. It's hard to explain. It's but what we see is that the way nature and society are organized, the way nature and society function, the way nature and society interact, it is hardly explained by looking at its parts separately. So the approach we use to understand how the ocean works, how coastal systems works, how one can manage, govern the coast and the ocean is through the socio-ecological systems lens. So human and nature is part of the same system. Human society shapes nature, nature shapes human society. Humans and natures co-evolve. And the subsystems, the social and the ecological, are inevitably linked and integrated, and the limitation between the two systems is artificial and arbitrary. So this is probably things that you have seen so far, but I want to start with this basic definition. So when we talk about the frameworks, you are all in the same path. So here is an example of coastal zone features and processes. The figure shows a lot of human activities, a lot of interactions, how nature provides to humans services, how humans affect natures, and the concept I want to bring is one that has been used a lot recently. That is the concept of ecosystem services. And what is ecosystem services? The ecosystem services approach consider that all that nature provides as material, non-material, and regulation characteristics that serves the human population, that increases human well-being, are considered services. There are clusters in provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and supporting services. That according to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment approach that we'll see in a couple of minutes. It's important to understand these concepts because much of the interactions that we see when you look at socio-ecological system has to do with humans benefiting from the system. So that's the benefits that the systems provide to humans are the ecosystem services. Despite their new terminology emerging, and I will talk about that in the next talk after the break. In addition to understand that humans modify nature, impact nature, manage nature, and nature provides service to humans, we have to understand how systems, how nature and societies are connected at different scales. Hence, one important concept here is the concept of scale. And scales and levels are different concepts, despite it is used and interchangeably a lot. For the purpose of the approach we are using, the frameworks I will present later, we understand scales as the spatial scale, the temporal scale, institutional scale, and within one scale you have different levels. So, for instance, for management, you have the tasks, you have the projects, you have the strategies. For socio-political scale, depending on the country you are. If you are in a country that has county, municipalities, state, nation, that's one scale. In other countries, you don't have the county, you have municipality, provinces, and the nation. The other, you have districts. So depending on which system you are looking at, and it varies a lot, you have different levels within a scale, levels of organization. And ecosystems are also organized in different scales. And nature is organized in different scales. In different levels within a scale, I'm sorry. So if you are studying biology, if you're more biology, you have the populations, you have the communities, and then you have the ecosystem, and then you have the landscape, and then you have the biomes. So it's all organized in different levels within the ecological scale. In order to understand ecosystem dynamics, an ecologist named Holling starts to understand the interactions, prey-predator, and in modeling that, he realizes that ecological changes are not gradual or continuous, that they are episodic. That spatial attributes are not uniform or invariable at different scales, and that ecosystem has no single equilibrium state, but may alternate, have alternating stable states and multiple equilibria, and that ecosystems are hierarchically structured, which he's named Parnaki later on. So in starting looking at insect-plant interactions and modeling that, he realized that his research triggered a paradigm shift within the ecological thinking about ecosystem dynamics. And in understanding ecosystems dynamics, why paradigm shift? At least when I went to undergrad school 30 years ago, so I learned like the ecological succession, right? So there's first stage and the second stage, and then you get the climax. And in my mind at the time, I thought that, well, you have like the grass, and then there's the pioneer trees, and then the secondary trees, and then you have the forest, and that's where the system stays. The forest level, it's the climax, and system doesn't change. Might be my misconception, but that's what I learned like in high school and then in the college. And the paradigm shift that Holling brought is that, well, systems are always evolving, and actually there are cycles, and these cycles he proposed that are, that are how do I say? These cycles occurs over and over again in the same system. And the cycles, like the first part, the from the exploitation to conservation. That's what we learn in the ecological succession that brings to the conservation to the climax. And then that usually is low, it increases slow. The capital, the biomass, how the different parts of the ecological systems are linked to each other. It increases the connectivity and the potential as well to release all the energy and matter that accumulates over time. Then something happened, a disturbance, like a fire in the forest, or I will show later on, I studied a lagoon system, and the lagoon sometimes connected with the ocean, and there was an explosion to open the channel between the lagoon and the ocean. So there are episodic events that trigger change into the ecosystem. And the way the matter and the energy that are connected are released are very fast. They're released very fast. And they need to reorganize into something that can be a system similar to the one that was initially there, like initially between brackets, that was previously there, or something else. And how the system will reorganize depend on the sources, the memory of that system, the ecological memory of that system. And in understanding these connections between the different levels of the ecological scale, Holling proposes this panarchy that is, as the first one, is an heuristic model to understand the dynamics of ecosystems. So, if a system is reorganizing, let's talk about the middle level here. When reorganized, if you are, in the case of the lagoon that I work with, new species comes from the ocean when the channel connecting the lagoon to the ocean was open. If you're talking about a fire in a forest, new species may come from other parts of the forest to that part of the forest. And on the other hand, that is the remembrance, called the memory of the system. And when when there's a release in one part of the system, that can foster releases in large parts of the system, the higher levels of the system. So a fire, for instance, that starts in a small patch can go to very large forests and destroy a lot of things. So why is it important to understand this issue of the scale, the cross scale? Because a lot of the policies are made without taking that into account. So it's important to understand the cycles, the geological, the ecological, the policy, the management, the legal institutional cycles, when we are dealing with marine and coastal socio-ecological systems. So in Holling's definition, resilience is the extent to which ecosystem can absorb recurrent natural and human perturbation, and continue to regenerate without slowly integrate or unexpectedly flipping into an alternate state. Who in the room have learned about resilience before today in this sense? Raise your hands. Okay, just want to know. And who hasn't? Raise your hands. Okay, so everybody are very familiar. I'm just trying to see, I'm going very slowly because I really want, my idea was like to cover the basics here. So I can speed up. The capacity of the system to observe disturbance and undergo change and still retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. The resilience can be measured by the width of how much disturbance it can absorb before it flipping to a different system. And when it flips to a different system, when it approaches the threshold, it flips to a different system. So in a coral system, for instance, it can change totally to a different system, and the energy to recover, to bring back to the other in the previous system might be impossible actually, or it has to be a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of resources to do that. So when you have a system in a good, in a desirable state, you want to maintain resilience. But when the system is degraded, you want to transform the system. You don't want to keep that system resilient. And in order to transform the system, you need to prepare for transformation. And when there are windows of opportunity, you need to navigate that window of opportunity and change the system to a different system. What means that you have to change the structure and the function of the system. And as I said in the previous slide, it takes a lot of resources, human resources, financial resources, time, which is a major resource. So we have really to think when we are dealing with coastal and marine issues, trying to understand the dynamics of the system, how we shape the system, how we frame the system, and what we need to do to manage that system. So the resilience thinking can be applied for both ecological and socio-ecological systems, and it has three characteristics: the amount of change a system can undergo and retain the same function and structure, the degree that is able to self-organize, and the ability to build and increase its capacity to learn and adapt. The concept I cover very slowly, I know, are very important because now we're going to talk about the frameworks that have been developed to understand socio-ecological systems. And these concepts are not really in the frameworks, but they underline all or most of the frameworks. And that's why they are important to have very clear which these concepts are. So before we move to the frameworks, I wonder if you have any questions or might raise your hand. Nope. Very clear? Yes.
I don't quite understood the difference between scale and level.
Okay. The question is about the difference between scale and level. So the scale, let's say spatial scale. You have a meter, you have 100 meters or kilometer. You have thousands of kilometers. So these are the levels. 1 meter, 1 kilometer are levels within the spatial scale. Or within a institutional scale, like institution in the sense of socio-political. The socio-political scale for different countries, as I said, are different. Because some has, like in Brazil, we have municipal, state, regional, that is subnational, and national level. So that is our, in Canada it's different, in United States it's different, and probably in several other countries are different. Like, so it's the level within a scale. Any other question?
Just wondering, is there any difference between socio-ecological system and human environment dimension, something like that? I find this school of thought coming from America, and then the residence schools in Stockholm, do they have same thing or they're different from each other?
The question is if socio-ecological systems is the same or similar to human and environmental dimension.
Yes.
Is that?
Yes.
First, we need to understand what is a dimension. It can be, you have economic dimension, you have social dimension, you have political dimension, you have ecological dimension, you have environmental dimension. So you have, why is ecological different from the environment? For instance, the environment is more than just ecologically. It might depend on the school you are coming from. Depend on, like, if you're talking from the perspective from social science, from natural science, and within natural sciences, which natural sciences, like Earth system, depend. Different people give different names to similar things. All socio-ecological system has both the environmental and the human dimensions. It's a matter, in my understanding, of how you frame your question, or you frame the problem you want to address. I have read papers about eco-social system instead of socio-ecological system. So are different schools that bring different perspectives. What I normally say to my students is, don't get into much on this trying to find the perfect term, because you can spend your entire thesis just trying to find the right term. It's better, like, if you choose a term and you justify why you choose that term, refer who is the proponent of that framework of that term, and follow up with your thesis. Otherwise, you do a philosophical thesis and not an applied thesis where I understand that most of you here are on ocean research and governance. That's more applied related thesis. And that's why I have here, I brought a couple of examples of frameworks that are both those that analyze the systems, those that are oriented just to analyze, to understand systems, and others that are more focused on action-oriented frameworks. Any other question before I proceed? Nope. Okay, so the frameworks I brought here are ones that I have used or I came across in several work or teamwork I've done in the past. Just want to say there are many others out there. So it's just an examples. Some are very famous. Some are less known. So some are proposed by researchers. Some are proposed by environmental commissions. So are different. They came from different sources, and they have different purposes. None are better than others. They all serve the purpose they were created. And that's something that you have to have in mind when to choose which framework to use. You have to think, what are my questions? Right? And then which one may best help me to answer my questions? So, because we are working in coastal and marine areas, this is a complex one proposed by Tom Charles about the fisheries management system. So there are the natural ecosystem, the management system, and the human system. And they're all interlinked. And there are sub-components of each of the systems that are linked within the system or with parts of the other subsystems. I'm not going to go in detail on each one of those, but the idea is to give you that there are different ways of representing the socio-ecological systems. Another framework that was developed by Berkes and Folk and others within the Resilience Network project in the late 1990s is this one that looks at traditional management systems. And as you can see, there are levels of the social system and the ecosystem are organized in different levels, and you can look at them, depending on your questions, how they are embedded in one another. So in terms of local ecological knowledge and traditional management or traditional ecological knowledge, the focus is how the local ecosystem dynamics are understood by those who manage the system, and how this understanding shape the practice of those managing the system. And once you manage the system, the natural system reorganize and in a different way or in the same way, and then there's this constant adaptation of the knowledge and the practice regarding the dynamics of the system. This one is probably the most well-known framework of socio-ecological systems that was proposed by Elinor Ostrom, a political scientist who works with common pool resources, which encompass water, fisheries, forests, and other resources for which controlling access is costly or impossible. And when you take a piece of the cake, there's less cake for the others. So that's what they call the subtractability property of the system. And Elinor Ostrom was awarded the Nobel Prize of Economics because of her work in trying to understand the dynamics of socio-ecological system in commons system. So she proposed that the resource system, let's say the fisheries, the resource units, how much catch you get, the governance system, and the users of that system, they all interact. And that interaction produces outcomes. And that outcomes are related to the social and ecological system, and the socio-economic and political settings shape that outcome. So a different way of presenting that, when you're thinking about, remember the issue of scale, and you have to think about the different levels of interactions within scale. That's a different version of that same framework. That you have levels of interactions and of resources. Another framework is the one that has been developed by the Community Conservation Research Network, which Tom Charles will talk about, probably with you in his talk next week. And in this network, our aim has been to understand how communities are connected to their environment. So the interactions that we look at are what are the meaning for conservation, what are the motivation of conservation, what are the outcomes of conservation. And again, we look at the subsystem of the resources and the governance. Another one that may be familiar to those coming from Europe, the deep sphere. The deep sphere looks at drivers that cause pressures over the ecological systems, that affects the state of that system, that impact the human, the ecological systems, that generate responses, and the responses can be response to drivers, response to the pressures, response to the state, and so these are all linked. And it was proposed by the European Environmental Agency. Another framework, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Framework. And here there's where that ecosystem services concept I brought is very well described. At the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the idea was to understand how nature, how the ecosystems contribute to human well-being. So the constituents of well-being were security, basic material for good life, health, good social relation, freedom of choice and actions. These are examples of how the ecosystem service provides well-being. The ecosystem, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was concluded in 2005. In 2012 was created the Intergovernment Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. That is IPBES, and IPBES starts to foster new assessments regarding the contributions of nature to human well-being, to quality of life, which will be my talk after the break. And IPBES developed a framework that advances a bit on the ecosystem framework, the ecosystem assessment framework, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Framework. Why? Because IPBES is looking at the different drivers of change, the difference, how it's affecting natures, how biodiversity and ecosystems affects ecosystem services, how ecosystem services affect human well-being. And this framework, what are the policy options for this, for a system that has been degraded or that need to be conserved? So these are all questions that are posed by IPBES. And what is interesting in this framework that others didn't bring is that, if you can see it, some of the boxes have 3 different colors. And you have, it's very policy oriented, this one. So the black is related to policy decision makers' language. The green, the academics, the researchers, the scientists. And the blue, the indigenous people approach languages on. So it brings, aims to bring a diversity of values and knowledge system in understanding the dynamics of socio-ecological systems at regional and at global scale. The regional assessments were released this year, and Jake Rice, who gave the talk yesterday, and myself, the work with an Argentinian colleague, Maria Elena Zaccanini, to coordinate the Americas assessment. And the global assessment will be released March next year. So we'll be the first one since the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment for the global level. So these were a few examples of frameworks. My question to you now is, thinking about your systems, where you work, how do you define your socio-ecological system? Answers? Try? Your stakeholders? Good. Great. What defines your socio-ecological system?
The resource, the ecosystem, the actors, humans, how they're connected.
Mm-hmm.
Three things we have.
So the resources, and the humans that use the resources and how they are connected. The ecosystem, yeah.
I believe that the question you are trying to answer partially defines your social ecosystem, because if you want to know, depending on the place you are, depending on the circumstances, different actors and different elements of the environment, not the environment, different elements will be present. If you are like talking about very distant, maybe very few people live there, you have very few actors and maybe a homogeneous environment. But sometimes we are in the coast, there's like ocean ecosystems and land ecosystems and many different actors. So the place and the situation you are will define your social ecosystem. Who is in there? What is in there?
What defines your socio-ecological system is your question. How the boundaries of your socio-ecological system is defined by your question or by the problem you want to address. That's what defines, because if we think that Earth is a socio-ecological system, a community, a coastal community using a lagoon is a socio-ecological system.
Acho que tem uma pergunta.
I think my socio-ecological system is a marine protected area, and all of it, the places, the actors, the governance. So is one doubt of mine doubt if I can define by the marine protected area.
Yes, you may. Depend on your question. If your question is to understand the governance of a marine protected area, your socio-ecological system is the marine protected area, and ever human groups relate to that, and all the dynamics. Nevertheless, it is embedded in other large ecosystem. So, as the colleague said there, what are the stakeholders? So the actors. What are their interests, their values, their knowledge systems? These are all questions that you have to have in mind when you are designing your research. What is the biophysical scale that will help you to address your problem? The level within the biophysical scale that will help to address your problem, that you should focus. What is the level within the social, the institutional scale that you should focus to help to address your problem? depends on the problem. It can be a marine protected area within a country. If you are addressing, as I suppose Leandro will talk about tomorrow, like if you're addressing the tuna fish management, it cannot be within a nation's board. It has to be involve several other countries. So it all depends on the question you are addressing. And what is the time scale? So if you're trying to understand dynamics of change, drivers of change, the resilience of a system over the years, the time scale, it's very important. If you want to understand, if your problem is just managing from here on a marine protected area, it's important to understand what has tried before. But you might be focusing like in the last 5 years or 10 years and not in the last 5, 10 decades. So depend on your questions, depend on your problems. And if you're doing with geological problems, like can be millennia or centuries. So just a few examples here. Like in coastal areas, you have tons of stakeholder groups, and here is just a few of them. I have worked in a marine protected area that's near an urban. It's not near. It is around an urban center that has a port, that has a chemical industry, that has a lot of tourism. And the marine protected area was created and established there without taking into account all the other uses that were there before. So can you imagine the amount of conflicts that emerged from that? In terms of scale, as I mentioned, when you have the geographic scale, like if you think about the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, there are subregions, countries, watersheds, and the jurisdiction. There's the international agreements, regional, national agreements, community plans, and the networks, all links. So there are cross scale. When we say cross scale, we have cross levels and cross scale, because sometimes you are crossing levels among different scales, and sometimes you are crossing levels within the same scale. Depend again on your question, on your problem. So just to give these slides, by the way, these and some others previous to this was provided to me by my friend and colleague Patrick McConney, which I'm very thankful for him letting me use his slides. So I like this one, that you have like all the different nations in the Caribbean, but when you look at the ecological system, they're not that diverse when you're talking about large ecological systems, marine systems. So in our work to understand marine ecosystem-based management in the large Caribbean, McConney and other friends talked about how these institutions are nested levels of governance. So are issues to be considered when framing your research. Another way to show the interactions of policy and policy cycles at different levels, from islands to the entire regions to global level. So these are all examples of interactions of socio-ecological systems, nested socio-ecological systems. And when we're talking about socio-ecological systems, one of the frameworks I presented are interesting to understand the pressures, the drivers of change, and especially in coastal and marine ecosystems. There, depending on where you are in the world, there are different pressures, different drivers of change. So here we just name some of the indirect drives of change leading to direct drives of change in the ecosystem of the Brazilian coast. And this is a work that a team of researchers, which Alex Turra and myself were involved, generated. And you see there are some drivers that are economic, some are social, some are even religious drivers. And it does cause change in the ecosystem, believe me. Culture. So this is an example of the deep seer that works with the drivers and the response and impact state and pressures, and relates to the marine pollution. Just to illustrate it, how these frameworks can be used. Another example is out of my PhD dissertation, the Ibiraquera Lagoon, which is located in the south coast of Brazil. And this is the lagoon I mentioned that is interconnected to the ocean sometimes, some parts of the year. You can see there is a small channel that's sometimes open, sometimes closed. And we use the resilience of socio-ecological system to understand the dynamics of fisheries management in that lagoon over decades. So we have, we have an example of the panarchy, how different systems are connected. So when the lagoon channel opens and the water flows to the ocean, it releases a lot of shrimp larvae, baby shrimp, and small fishes to the ocean. And at the same time, when fish schools are passing by that area, it enters the lagoon when the channel is open. Then the channel closes with the dynamics of the coast. The channel closes, and the lagoon can be closed without connection to the ocean for months or even a year. And the water salinity of that lagoon decreases as time passes because it has the fresh water coming in but no salt water. And the level of the water increases and the pressure on the channel increases until the channel is open naturally or explodes to the ocean again. So there's all this connection between the lagoon, the small system of the lagoon, to the ocean in front of it. And we look at the fisheries management of that lagoon over a period of 40 years, 4 decades. And we see there are crises and reorganization of the system. But the system is still operating within the same domain. It's still, by the time I finished that research, which was almost 20 years ago, by that time, the system was still a fishing system mainly, with some tourism, but mainly fisheries. It was operating as the lagoon. Now, here we use the risk model of the resilience of the panarchy to understand fisheries management. But we can use the same model, for instance, when your question is not about your socio-ecological system, is not the fisheries management that defines the socio-ecological system, but the livelihood. So Débora Prado, who is here, worked in this community Aventureiro in Rio de Janeiro coast and looked at the resilience of the livelihoods there. And also using the same risk model to understand how this has at the same time changed and maintained a structure in function. And another example is when we analyze diverse cases of integrated conservation and development linked to the Equator Initiative, which is the UN Development Program initiative that highlight the work of communities in conserving biodiversity, environment, and also in developing livelihoods, develop social and economically. And when we look at several cases across the equator belt, we came with this framework here to understand that the changes, how the system self-organized, the social ecological system often has a trigger event, and that leads to a window of opportunity. And there are several ingredients, what we call, of that system for fostering self-organization in socio-ecological system at the local level. And there are a lot of feedback and learning, feedback cycles, learning cycles, and there are catalytic events that shape the initiative and build adaptive capacity. So again, these are examples of how you can frame, or you can, depend on what your question, you can look at socio-ecological systems. And well, this is one of the communities that we look at in that research. That's a Thailand mangrove forest restoration and management that provide the data to build that framework. And just to finalize, I want to, after this slow talk, and it's after lunch, we are always slow, so I just want to ask you, like, thinking about governance, do you think we shall foster resilience in socio-ecological system? Yes? No? And why?
Eric Wade, Belize. I don't know if resilience, in my opinion, I think I wouldn't say resilience, but adaptivity. I think social ecological systems we should be fostering adaptivity in those systems in order for resilience. Because adaptivity, the system would be able to adapt and feed back on itself and be able to move into the future based on the processes that are happening, and they'll be able to adapt both the ecosystems and the natural, both the natural system and the social system are able to adapt based on what each other is saying to them. So I don't know. I would say adaptivity, but and not resilience. But that's just me.
Thank you. Others?
I think it depends on the system and the state of the system. If you want it to be resilient, it's like your socio-ecological system is in a state that is a desired state, and you want to make it stable. Or if not, you shall not provide resilience. You shall provide transformability or something like that to change for a desirable state.
Exactly. I think both answers are good answers. It depends on the state of the system. And why I want to put this here, I mentioned throughout my talk on that, but it's just that resilience became those buzzwords that everybody's using. That's why I said, who has seen about resilience and resilience framework before? And everybody raised their hands. But it seems like we have to understand why and when to use resilience approach. And if the system is very degraded, you don't want to build resilience. Actually, that's very strong to break the resilience of a system when it is very degraded. You want actually to transform the system into a different system. And that is very important. So if it is in a desirable state, you want to build adaptability, as our colleague there said. It's right. But if it is in undesirable state, you want to build transformability, not resilience. Despite of that, we have done a lot of work in trying to understand what build resilience in socio-ecological system over this past 2 decades or so, 3. And in looking at coastal lagoon ecosystem, we have come across some of the clusters of factors that help to build resilience in local socio-ecological systems. And here are some of them that relates to learning to live with change and uncertainty, that promote diversity for reorganization renewal, that combine different types of knowledge, and that promote self-organization. So these are examples of cluster of factors that helps to build resilience, and these we learn from analyzing several coastal lagoons, socio-ecological systems. And to finalize, a group of young scholars looking at resilience at the different systems, terrestrial, aquatic, marine, inland, urban, and all the different kinds of socio-ecological systems that you can think of, have come to a set of principles to build resilience when systems are in a desirable state. And these are the 7 principles to build resilience in socio-ecological systems. And with regards to maintain diversity and redundancy, manage connectivity, manage low variables and feedbacks, foster complex adaptive system thinking, encourage learning, broaden participation, and promote polycentric governance systems. Of course, we could talk for each one of these principles an hour. Unfortunately, we don't have that time, but I really encourage you, if that's something that you are interested in, to look at the Resilience Stockholm Research Center, Stockholm Resilience Center, SRC, where there's a lot of material and where these understanding of dynamics of socio-ecological systems have been well developed and evolved over the years. Thank you. Questions? Yep.
I'm Mariana from Mariana from Brazil. I have two questions. Let me find the other one. It's somewhere here. Okay. The adaptive management need adaptive policies, but in some cases in Brazil, with protected areas, not just in coastal, but we have the management plan, and it has to be reviewed, but the times and the bureaucracy and the conflicts and a lot of reasons, even the management plans can't be reviewed. So this would be an example of adaptive management, because you plan, then you practice, and if you have to review it, you have the law to review, but in most cases it's not reviewed. So I'd like to know if you can comment this. And in my research, this marine protected area that I'm doing my research, it's created for more than 20 years, and the system, it's really degraded, and I don't know if foster resilience would be the solution anymore. Maybe transforming it, and the recategorization is one of the subjects. It comes and goes in some cycles of years, but it never happened. So it remains the same category of conservation unit. But if it becomes to transform, we don't know if it's going to be the solution. So how can we deal with these uncertainties?
First, on the concept of adaptive management. I try to skip here in my talk the management and the concepts of management, adaptive management, co-management, and governance and adaptive governance, because there are many others who will talk about that. Of course, those are dear concepts to me, and I work with them all the time. Anyway, in your, I don't know if I understood your question right, but you wanted me to comment on the issue that in law, we have adaptive management in Brazil. In practice, we don't, in most of the cases, with few exceptions. That's true, that's our reality, unfortunately. So management plans should be revised and adapted and improved. That doesn't happen in most of the places. What can be done to change that is context specific. So I don't know which area you were and what are the context there. But now, if we if we should focus in fostering resilience or fostering transformation, adaptability or transformation, again, you have to bring the different stakeholders to the table to understand what are the desirable system. And the desirable system might be different for different people, because different people has different values, and different values shape different interests. So there's all this complexity, and that's why we started this work, this presentation, talking about complex adaptive systems, because they are complex. There's no one solution. So we have to always navigate the complexity. And it's not because it's complex that we will not navigate, say, oh, forget about, there's nothing, so I won't work with that. No, there are ways of working there, but I would go away from the talk of this class here to get on that, but I'm happy to talk with you in the break.
Thank you.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for the talk. It was a very nice talk. And I have two questions here. The first one is that what is the significance of indicators in SES? Then number two is considering that time scale is very, very crucial in analyzing and working with socio-ecological systems. What is the situation where you are working in a case study where there are data deficiency or there are limited data, considering that you need to consider time scale as one of the parameters for SES? Thank you.
So the first question is the significance of indicators for socio-ecological systems management or socio-ecological system assessment, or, well, indicators are what turn it possible to compare two periods or two areas or different things, right? So again, I could talk about monitoring indicators, outcomes, and that would be another talk. But they are very relevant when you are talking about management, and especially if you're talking about adaptive management, because adaptive management is trying different options, policy options, and you have to measure before implementing the measures, the policy measures, and after implementing, you have to see if the system is going the direction you desire it to go, is in the pathway that you desire it to go, or not. So indicators are very, very relevant. Now, the second question, what to do about when you are in a data poor setting and you have to do management. Is that your question? There's a great paper from Bob Johannes talking about data-less management, which I like a lot, especially working with tropical fisheries. With most communities, we don't have any data records for more than a few years, if we have any at all, which is quite different from the temperate regions from the north, like especially like I'm sure the situation in the Caribbean is not different from the situation in Brazil or I don't know other tropical countries, perhaps in Africa or Indonesia. So there's a lot that sometimes you need to rely in traditional knowledge, local knowledge, and to get your data that you're missing, like that you did not collect as a research. And most of the time, in my experience, I found this data to be quite reliable and very important to plan management. So that's one option. The other option is take action, don't leave the system to continue to degrade. So you can use the precautionary principle. But there's, again, we always go back and talk about governance and management.
Good afternoon. I'm Oscar from Mexico, and this is my first time that I see this approach, and I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. And so my question is very basic or technical. I was watching this, and once that you understand the variables of your socio-ecological system, is this a framework to predict? It is a quantitative approach, or is it just qualitative?
It may be quantitative or qualitative, depend on your research approach. It can be very, very quantitative. It can sorry, I think I lose the question.
The idea is that if we know the connections between all the socio-ecological system, we can predict what could happen.
Oh, the predictability, yes,
Yeah.
okay. Okay, the other half of your question was if you can predict what, you can use scenario modeling of socio-ecological systems. Okay. We can use scenarios as, you can model socio-ecological systems, qualitative, quantitative, but you can also depend again on your question. If your question is to see, like, I have different policy options. If I do this, what will happen? If I do that, what will happen? Like you can use these scenarios to see what may happen, and you can use quantitative variables. You can use qualitative variables. But you can also use in a heuristical way of just understanding the dynamics of your system. Again, all depends on the question.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mariana. I'm from Venezuela. I wanted to know, what do you think about these indexes that mix indicators from ecosystem health, social indicators, management indicators into one index? And if you like these indexes, which one would you recommend?
I confess I'm not very, very familiar with that. Like I review one paper that trying to merge all these indicators into one. And I really question the type of indicators they want to compile to get to like one number for each region. There was a lot of, in my opinion, flaws on how the one research paper I revised on that. Okay, so this is not my opinion in general. I'm talking about like I could find some flaws on that. So that's, I cannot speak more than that.
Okay, thank you, Professor Christina, for this good presentation. You said that when considering the definition of socio-ecological system, one of the questions to ask was, who are the stakeholders, their interests, their knowledge, and their values? So I want to know, how do you have indexes, or how do you value stakeholders?
So you have what?
How do you value stakeholders? how do you value stakeholders? Like, do you mean some stakeholders could be more important than others?
No, no, sorry, I think, no, it's what are their values? What do they bring to the table? For instance, you have a MPA that is established over a no-take MPA that is established over the seascape where a fishing community have been for centuries. So you have, it's very important to conserve that species or keystone species or whatever, why they impose establish that no-take MPA there. But there's all the livelihoods that are lost. And there are the tourism industry that wants to build a resort there to use that as a no-take MPA, but explore the tourism there. So you see there are different sets of values that are in place. Interests and values. Why? Because I value that area because my grandfather, my great-grandfather always feed their family, and I'm here today because they feed my ancestors with the fish that come from that area. So that has a value that no other area can provide me. If you have the tourism resort, they have the values are very economically profitable. It's not related to the culture of that people there. It's not related. Do you understand the difference?
No, I understand.
It's not economic evaluation that I'm talking about. It's the different value systems
No, thank you.
that has to be taken into account when looking at socio-ecological systems for management, governance.
Thank you very much. My name is Shala. I would like to take you to the last example you had on the slide, where you talk about
This? No.
drivers, opportunities, windows of opportunity, just close to the last slide.
Sorry, this one?
No.
This.
No?
This.
Yes, this one.
Okay.
When you have a window of opportunity that is negative, in my case, I work in a lagoon in Lagos that naturally, the lagoon serves as a barrier for flooding in the city of Lagos. But now, you have a government who feels the best thing for the lagoon is to reclaim the land. So for me, that is the only way to start discussion on how to manage the lagoon. We don't have an MPA, we don't have any regulation on how to regulate fishery as far as the lagoon is concerned. So now government feels the best way to use the lagoon is reclaim the land, build new housing estates, of course for the rich, in this reclaimed land. The impact is we displace the community that depends on this lagoon, we destroy the mangrove, at the same time we change the ecological system of this lagoon. Now, this is the feeling of the government. Now the NGO, they have a different thinking. The developer has a different thinking. The community have a different thinking. So we are in a state of confusion. What should be the entry point? What should define my SCS? So should I focus on the human well-being? Should I focus on the barrier remaining do I focus on the flood remain as a barrier for the entire city, preventing flood? So how do I, as a scientist, at the same time an environmentalist, how do I communicate to the government which one should I, focus on first? Which one is important? Because for the government, what is important to them is reclaim the land, build. So we have competing factors here, but we are confused. We don't know which one, we are not thinking systemically. And if we have to do that, we have to consider scale of preference. Which one is important? Which one should we deal with first? So NGO, they are pro-community. Government is interested in money, and we're just in a state of confusion. And there is no regulation to actually guide on how to go about this situation. Thank you.
Okay. You talk about how to communicate to government, and that's a major issue, and it probably many of the cases, many of your study cases, your areas of study. How to communicate, because what you communicate is the information, and again, this information, the way you shape the system, the way you show the information is embedded with your values. You see? So the conservationist you want to preserve the mangroves. The fisherman wants to keep their livelihoods. The governments wants to make sure the flood doesn't go into the city. The people with money want to transform the mangrove in their second houses. So there's all these issues. So one way to do that is to start in talk and bring the different perspective and show like the trade-offs of who wins, who loses in the different scenarios that the lagoon might take. So communication is a very important issue for those working interested in governance. That's a key issue, I would say. And we need to communicate, not as science to scientists. We need to, what I say, touch the heart of the decision makers. You need to touch the heart. And when I talk decision makers, I'm not talking just politicians. We make decisions every day in our lives. So we need to really communicate to the information so that decisions made at the individual level, at community level, at governmental level, at the NGO, at the private sector, might be made based on the best knowledge available. And this best knowledge might be both the scientific knowledge, might be the indigenous, traditional, local knowledge when there's that less systems, and other systems. Any other question? We are running out of time, I guess.
Hi, I'm Natalia from Brazil. It's not a question, it's maybe like a response to your question. I think in this discussion with different stakeholders, with different trade-offs, the concepts of ecosystem services helped a lot in communication, because it makes really clear the importance and how we depend on the ecosystem that you want to preserve or conserve or restore. And I think it's make really clear to the other stakeholders to understand. I think the concept of ecosystem services helped a lot.
Good point.
Okay, guys, our time is off now for the coffee, so Chris will be with us in the next section of this afternoon. Let's stand up and stretch sometime and eat something, have a coffee.
Thank you.